Today we're asking a question that everyone has heard in this hobby since the 1980s. Is historical wargaming in decline? The hobby is graying and new players just aren't entering fast enough. But is that actually true? In this video, Little Wars TV talks to game designers, miniature manufacturers, publishers, podcasters, and hobby shop owners. We'll ask them if the hobby is growing and what barriers they see to attracting more players. So let's start by assessing the overall state of the hobby in 2020. I'll start by talking to one of the best-selling wargame designers in the United States, who, ironically, has a somewhat dim view of the future of historical miniature gaming.
Hi, I'm Sam MUSTAFA. I'm a wargame author and publisher and a historian.
Sam, as one of the few major historical wargame publishers and designers left in the United States, we thought that you would be the perfect person to ask. Is historical wargaming dying?
If you look at, say, the hobby now as opposed to 25 years ago, the major brands, if you will, in historical tabletop miniatures gaming were primarily Americans. Right, so Scott Bowden, the Empire series, Artie Conliffe and his games, published by Dave Wachtel, the Fire and Fury, Rich Hasenhauer, those guys, Avalon Hill with Napoleon's Battles, etc., etc. Frank Chadwick, GDW.
Sure.
I believe every single one of those is out of print, right? Or hasn't been active in at least 20 years.
Right, Fire and Fury is still in
actually
in a second edition.
You're right, you're absolutely right.
So, but for the most part, most of those operations have kind of folded up as businesses.
And so walk through the dealer area right now, right? And as I just did, and tell me if you can find a single made in America production there that wasn't there last year. Or to the year before that. Right? Where is the new stuff being produced by America? Now, maybe I missed a few. That's entirely possible. I'm not omniscient. But most of the new product is coming from overseas, where the hobby seems to be quite healthy, right? In Australia, New Zealand, Britain, on the European continent. But again, walk through that dealer hall and tell me, what is the average age you see in that dealer hall? There was a poll done recently on a big miniatures chat site, and it was just self-selection, but the poll found, I think, average age of the respondents was 58. That's average.
Right.
A couple years ago when I did Rommel, I guess that was 2 years ago, somebody reviewed it by saying I was one of the new up-and-coming names in the hobby. That
had to feel good, right?
I was 51 when that game came out, okay? So if I'm one of the new guys...
You're a young buck, 51.
Exactly. Then who the hell is the old guard?
Yeah.
So I think in the United States, historical tabletop miniatures gaming does appear to be dying out.
So how did that transition happen?
I think it's not a question of what happened, it's a question of what failed to happen, right? The hobby failed to attract a new generation of a significant number. I mean, now I bumped into David ENSTENESS just earlier, and he's younger than I am. I don't know how much younger, but at least 10 years younger than I am.
Oh, yeah.
And he's making a serious go of it. So, maybe soon you'll have someone else to say, you're the last man standing. But there doesn't seem to be, in the manufacturing publishing side of this, there doesn't seem to be a sort of replacement for the guys who were older than me. And the caveat here is that this is not based on statistics.
Right.
I don't have any data to support this. It's just anecdotal, so take that with whatever caution you may.
Speaking of data, if anybody has been sort of following our channel, then you know that we've been working with WSS Magazine, following the data from their great wargaming survey. Right. As far as we know, it's the only expansive source of hard data on the hobby. And the data there does show that the hobby is aging out. I think there's a lot of people that question, is it really graying? They were talking about it graying back in the 80s and the 90s, and we're still here.
That's because it was graying in the 80s and 90s. Right? When I started going in the 80s, I was in my late 20s, right? And everyone there had brown hair, right? And I'm still going. I still see the exact same guys, and we all have gray hair. Those of us who have hair, which is soon not to be me.
Well, thank you so much for giving some theories and talking about the state of the hobby.
Doom and gloom.
Well, maybe a little bit, but we've talked to a lot of other people in the hobby, other publishers, podcasters, hobby shop owners, game masters, and you're going to hear interviews from many of them as well as they weigh in with their thoughts.
Hi, I'm David from the Wargaming Company. That's what I got. That's who I am. That's what we do. I think the state of the hobby is changing significantly. I don't think it's in decline. I think it's likely growing, but it's not going to resemble the legacy of historical gaming. So historical wargaming is Bob sells me flags, David sells me some of the figures I need, Sally sells me other figures that I need, Jim sells me bases, but Alex sells me books, but not all of the books that I need. And none of the books are actually books for wargaming necessarily. I can get some history books that have some of the information I need for the scenarios, but those don't have maps. So then I need to find other books from George that have maps because I need maps to lay out my table. Then I need other ones to find orders of battle so I know what troops are there. And then I need hundreds or thousands of uniform plates in order to figure out what I should paint these guys like. The biggest barrier for historical wargaming is the product, if you will, that allows people to game isn't ready out of the box, put together for somebody. It's not kitted.
Oh, crikey, isn't that it's a $3 million question, isn't it? I see the hobby as being surprisingly healthy. I think that it's had a number of scares over the last decade or two, and there've been a lot of kind of doom soothsayers who said, oh gosh, it's greying, it's going to fizzle out in the next 5 years. And they've all been proved wrong. There seem to be more manufacturers now than there ever were when you take into account all the stuff that's happening on stuff like Kickstarter, lots of crossover games, so there's people moving between kind of miniatures wargaming and the kind of board game world. There's a lot happening there. It strikes me that it's actually surprisingly, in rude health. Now, it would probably be going too far to say that it's growing. I wouldn't like to necessarily say that, but I think it's certainly holding its own.
Hi, I'm Brett Stoner. I started the Comic Store West in York, Pennsylvania. I think just historicals are just a tough sell for the main, because I don't think people are exposed to the history of it. The hobby store industry right now is tough. We're competing with Amazon, we're competing with the internet. For a store to sell historical miniatures, you need that alpha gamer who's into it, and it's tough. It's tough because people are going to go. It's bad enough with fantasy. Warhammer comes to mind. They compete with that online. Historical, there's all these little companies making all various scales. It's just a tough product to carry in a retail store where space is a premium. That square foot has to turn and has to make you money. Games Workshop can do that for you. It's tough for Civil War miniatures that you're going to turn that a lot. But there are stores I know that carry historical miniatures. They tend to be in bigger markets or they have an online presence.
I think at the moment there's definitely a growth in historics, and it's been led by companies like Warlord and Battlefront that have made it much easier to get into historics. Some of those companies aren't everybody's tastes. Some of them play a little bit fast and loose with the hobby and with history, but the games themselves are great because they pull people in from the more science fiction and fantasy backgrounds. It's an easy stepping stone, and from there then they can explore whatever sort of areas they want to see. I don't think it's stagnating. I do think it's growing, but it's probably a much smaller growth than we see from some other companies where they'll explode onto the scene.
What's going on, everybody? It's Joe from God's Eye Games and the Acceptable Casualties here to do a little Q&A for the boys over at Little Wars TV. I don't know if we're necessarily shooting through the roof as far as growing goes, but we're not really losing players either. I know where we're at in the group of guys that I play with. We're pretty steady with what we have. If you look over to the business side, maybe the manufacturing side, as far as how the business is doing right now, I know from our perspective at God's Eye Games, Sons of Mars did really well. So there's obviously people out there that are willing to spend the money and try new rule sets and give things a shot, and that's a good sign for the community in general. We have such a, it's history. We have such a wide variety of stuff, whether it's you want to play, the Age of Samurai, you want to play medievals, you want to play ancients, you want to do World War II, World War I. I mean, there's so many different genres, and, you go to different players in historical wargaming, you know, a lot of us have collections, but we don't have everything covered. So it's kind of hard to find common ground to maybe, you know, set that hook on a newer player. Like you might have a guy who really enjoys, you know, old school like samurai movies or anything like that. And, you know, that might be a great way to set the hook, but maybe you don't have that collection. So it's kind of hard to set the hook on that player and be like, hey, you know, you check this out. I got this samurai wargame thing. Maybe you should check out, you know, and looking into the hobby. So I think that's another barrier as far as getting newer players into the hobby for wargaming in the historical sense.
Is the hobby growing? Yes. Is the historical wargaming hobby growing? Maybe. I think what's happening is that people are tending to describe themselves more as gamers rather than wargamers, and the type of games that they're playing is diversifying. So yes, they will play historical war games, but they'll also play fantasy war games. They'll also play board games and card games. Is that a negative thing? Well, it's probably neither positive nor negative, but the important thing in there is that as more people are connecting with games as a social hobby rather than sitting at home tapping away at the keyboard, that they are being introduced into historical games as well as other sorts of games.
I've only got anecdotal evidence for it. I'm sure we're seeing more historical games at shows. That might be just me. And I'm absolutely positive that we're seeing more historical games, or at least games with historical figures. Your mileage may vary on how historical the rules are, but we're certainly seeing a lot more historical figures at our club. When I was first chairman, I would have said that the most popular games were 40k for a while and then War Machine, but it's now very, very definitely Bolt Action, followed by a number of other things which are also historical. So yeah, it's growing a bit. I wouldn't say it's taking over, but there's certainly more historical gaming than there was.
The idea that somehow that wargaming or historical wargaming in particular is declining, I think is folly, when all the evidence we see says otherwise.
I think the hobby is definitely growing at the moment. We're getting more diversity, getting young people getting involved in the hobby, I think. More women getting involved into the hobby. I think there's also a transference of a lot of people from board wargaming and board games through into tabletop wargaming as well.
I think that when we look at barriers to a wider audience, I think we're looking at, you know, it's going to be getting people away, you know, off the screen, getting them away from the computer or the console or their handheld device, you know, mobile device, however you want to term it. I've said it many times before, there are so many great aspects about tabletop gaming, especially miniatures tabletop gaming. The artistic aspect, the research aspect, there's more to it than just opening a box and playing. And one of the advantages I think there is to tabletop gaming, especially miniatures gaming, is every person who opens up a tabletop game, especially miniatures game, they make it their own.
Thanks to all of our guests and hobby insiders, including those who we interviewed and didn't appear in this video. We did want to end with J. Arnold's hopeful optimism, because next week we're going to be back with 5 big, game-changing ideas to shake up the historical wargaming hobby and grow this community.